Hey, world history friends, here we go. We are on to our lecture on the collapse of the Roman Republic. So we've been establishing details of the Roman Republic, its governmental forms, its uh, the Punic Wars, and also the nature of the army. But now we come to a key transition where it goes from a republic into an imperial empire. So um, let's go ahead and dive right in. We have 3 points, all 3 points being the key elements to its collapse and transition. This is just a summary slide of those 3 points. We're going to be looking at the issue of, or the influence of imperial expansion, the growth of slavery, and then finally this idea of new paths to power. And there's our friend, face right next to mine, Mr. Julius Caesar. So here we go. Let's dive into the first point, imperial expansion. So we've talked a lot about this and how the expansion of the Roman Republic over centuries was the result of a successful army, its increasing trade, the really going on turbocharge after the Punic Wars, where they usurped Carthage as the primary Mediterranean power. And so with this expansion kind of comes great prosperity. Rome is just bringing in lots and lots of land, lots and lots of resources, lots and lots of slaves, lots and lots of influence and tribute and taxes. And so the level of greed and kind of a lust for more, or the desire to maintain that expansion in order to sustain this above for the Roman upper classes and those in the high seats of power becomes untenable, or becomes kind of insatiable. And so there is a real issue of greed from the prosperity of this expansion. And with that, they see a real corruption with values. It's really hard. One of the truisms of life is it's not your failures that will destroy you. They'll oftentimes teach you and harden you and refine you, but it's your successes that might destroy you. And that was definitely the idea that Cicero, known as the kind of the last defender of the Roman Republic, we'll be watching a little video on him this week or next week, depending on when you're watching this, who says, it was the success of this expansion that really corrupted the Roman character, and the corruption of that Roman character was going to really feed on out into the larger government and society and lead to its decline. The point also to make is that due to this expansion, Rome, although still a republic in governmental form, was an empire before it had emperors. And so that as soon as they began to govern and conquer and rule these other outside nations beyond who was a Roman citizen, that made them an empire. And so it really was the empire came first, and in a way helped undo the republic government, leading to the rise of Roman emperors. That's a statue there of Cicero, the father of the Roman Republic. Here's just a map of that Roman Empire. You can see its growing expansion. Um, Again, even in the form of the Republic, you can see how far beyond just Italy and, of course, Rome itself they had grown into Spain, Gaul, which is modern day France, the Middle East, Turkey, the part of that the nation willed to them by the king of Pergamum, and then North Africa, and eventually in control of Egypt. So Rome is on its way to incredible territorial gains, and it's just going to be too much for the republic to maintain. And so it moved secondly to slavery. Part of that expansion included the influx of thousands and tens of thousands of slaves into the Roman Republic. Slavery in Rome was widespread. It was very common. It was brutal, and it was non-racial. It wasn't like a racial or ethnic slavery. You're an inferior race. It was simply, hey, you're the losers. You lost in war. You can see the greatest source was military conquest, and so you are a slave because we defeated you, not necessarily because you're not human or anything like that. So it's a different form of slavery than what we think of as American racial slavery. Slaves could be found all throughout Roman society. They could be servants in the home. They could be tutors. They could row galley ships across the Mediterranean. They oftentimes worked in the mines. So depending on what your life as a slave, and that all never good, definitely depended on where you ended up. The mines being one of the most horrific places with incredibly short lifespans for slaves, on up to you could have slaves with considerable power if they're put in charge of tutoring a wealthy Roman's children or helping to administer his estate. And as the empire expands and the slave population increases, Rome experiences more and more slave revolts, especially moving into what we'd call the first or the second and then first century BC. So the the 100 BCs and then the tens BCs, you get more and more revolts because the slaves become a more influential and widespread group of people within the empire. Now, Spartacus, the famous movie Spartacus, and I think there was a TV show not too long ago, memorialized, that being one of the more famous slave revolts. And they called these slave revolts the servile wars, the wars of those who are servile or the slaves. There were three major ones during the decline of the Republic. There were two in Sicily, the island just off the boot of Italy. We're going to read one of those, a primary source related to the first one. And then there's a third one that hits the actual mainland of Italy. And this is the famous Spartacus Rebellion, in which he starts by leading a group of gladiators, because that's something else slaves could be made to do, fight in the various colosseums and amphitheaters of Rome for the entertainment of the masses. And his rebellion grew to be up to 120,000 slaves. So that's very significant in that that's not just, there's a few escaped slaves running around the country. That is an open insurrection and threat to the peace and prosperity of the countryside and the society. Eventually, two powerful Roman generals, Crassus and Pompey, we'll be talking about them later, helped put down Spartacus's rebellion. And famously, to make an example of these slaves, in order to try to deter future rebellions, 6,000 of them were crucified along, I think, what's known as the Appian Way, but was basically a road, almost like a highway, a Roman highway, in which they just lined up the slaves, as depicted here in the Spartacus film. And so again, we think of Jesus a lot of times when we think of crucifixion, but it's always an important reminder that crucifixion was a Roman form of public torture / execution. And again, they did that during the third servile war to discourage future would-be Spartacuses. Just going back to these pictures, you got a picture of the various gladiators. We'll be talking about them, and when we get to the imperial time, and a statue there of Spartacus. Okay, a little bit more on the growth of slavery is that at one point slavery gets so widespread that there's a ratio of free men within Rome to slaves of 1 to 10. So very quickly, this happened in southern United States prior to the Civil War, but you actually get locations where you have more slaves than you have free Roman citizens. That is not a good thing when the oppressors or the rulers or the ones who are supposed to uphold the culture and the values of a society and its government are the minority. And the majority are disenfranchised slaves who have no desire, no bearing, no investment in the society, and really would like to see it maybe changed or torn down or torn asunder. That's going to be a big problem. Creates that discontent underclass, but also brings economic disaster for common Romans. Something overlooked is that if there's free slave labor to be had, what is the actual farmer supposed to do who's trying to earn a fair price by his own work? What's the common laborer or craftsman supposed to do when he who has to charge enough for his prices to pay for himself as a free laborer has to compete with other businessmen and farmers who can have slave labor? And so not only do you get this disproportionate amount of non-Roman citizens living in your area, in your nation, but you also get that the free people, the ones who are citizens, suddenly begin to suffer and lose their economic footing. Romans are a minority of citizens, and of course, I've already said, you get this loss of common values in terms of what it means to be Roman, what it means to be a citizen soldier, what it means to live a good Roman life. Now you have a huge majority of people living with you in your nation who are like, we don't care. We're not part of Rome. We have no investment in Rome. We're your slaves. That's going to lead to a lot of unrest. And if you want to appeal to the Roman Constitution, or you want to appeal to Roman values, or a love of law, or a love of the Republic, you're not going to get people saying, buying into that, because they're kind of outsiders of your society. And all of a sudden, a lot of your society is made up of those outsiders. Thirdly, so we talked about, so there's the imperial expansion, and then there are the growth of slavery. And then we get this idea that there's new paths to power. So as Roman society is really reshaped through this, the expansion of new territories into a practical empire, as you get more and more of a slave presence, the ability to have influence and power in Roman society changes. Typically, there was this thing called the cursus honorum, or the royal way. or the honorable way. And this was how does somebody rise from being a Roman citizen, whether a patrician, a nobleman, or a plebeian, a commoner, to hold influence and power in the Roman Republic? Typically, I won't go through each step, but there was kind of like stepping stones on a ladder of offices you could hold that would, you'd serve for a number of years in time, that as you climb that ladder, before you became a consul, or before you became a praetor or dictator or a censor or joined the Senate, you would have had to basically prove your ability, your maturity, your support, your respect and knowledge of the Roman Republic and how it works. You understand why there's checks and balances. You understand your history. You understand why you should or shouldn't follow certain protocols. And that ensured kind of the sustainability of the empire. The republic. Because the people who held the power had climbed this ladder and they knew what it took to get there, and they knew the values and the culture that put them there. That's the cursus honorum. But following the Second Punic Wars, you begin to get a new way beyond the cursus honorum in which to gain power, and that is primarily through, Rome's dominant institution, the military. And that what you find is with the increased expansion and the increased influence of the armies and the increased success and wealth brought by the armies, you get these soldiers, and particularly generals, who gain incredible popularity, they gain incredible wealth, and they translate that into powerful office, namely ultimately becoming a consul. And so this means you begin to get men who hold the powerful office of consul, who have not climbed that cursus honorum and don't have that respect for the republican institutions, but instead have been put there because of the influence they have with their soldiers, or their popularity among the people, because they're kind of they're popular because of the victories in the military that they've brought on. And so you begin to get these men who have taken a different path to power, who are not as stable or as, again, invested in maintaining the Roman Republic. And as multiple generals begin to vie for power, it becomes less of maybe a political rivalry. Did I get more votes than you? Who have I swayed? Who have I served in order to have support? You actually get to have men of force and violence, military rulers with their own loyal armies, deciding their rivalries by violence, rather than, again, as it says, their debate or vote. They're not settling their disputes politically and peacefully. They're deciding their disputes through force of arms. And so you're going to see we see an outbreak of more civil unrest and even civil war in the first century BC, during the last decades of the Roman Republic. Just as a case study, an example, in the heydays in the 5th century of the Roman Republic, you have the example of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a general. He was elected dictator. He was just a farmer, and then consul, and then Rome is invaded, and they're under threat from outsiders. So he is given the powers of the dictator, emergency powers to save the state. He ends up defeating and successfully leading the army. He wields the absolute power for the allotted 6 months. He defeats the enemy, and then he surrenders that authority. He retires from his command, and he returns back to being a simple Roman farmer, being a simple citizen. The statue of him, there he is with his plow behind him, and what he's holding is called the fasces, but it's a symbol of the dictatorial power that he was given in order to save Rome, and he's willingly surrendering that because he said, yeah, I know how the Republic works. I use this to save Rome. I'm now letting go of power, and I'm going to go back to being just another citizen. That he's actually, if that sounds familiar, George Washington modeled his career and a lot of his character on the example of Cincinnatus, as did a lot of other future American and Republican leaders. He was kind of that idyllic idea of, I only wield power for the good of my nation, and then I'm willing to surrender that because I respect my institutions, I respect my government more than I desire power for myself. Well, in this last century BC, we have two other examples, two generals named Sulla and Marius. Sulla is a successful general. He is successful in combat. His troops love him. They're very loyal to him. And twice, in order to get what he wants politically, he marched his soldiers on Rome. In other words, he threatened Rome. It'd be like a general bringing his troops back from Afghanistan and marching on Washington so that the politicians would give him what he wants. He gets his position within the government. He's elected consul. And then, rather than ruling the Roman people, he uses his influence and his power and his military loyalists to purge his opponents, to remove them, to exile those who opposed him politically, or to even kill them. again, it'd be like a president who wins the election, and then rather than say, okay, I'm everybody's president, I know you didn't win, but let's all be Americans, he says, no, now anybody from the other party who didn't vote for me, you've got to leave or I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to take all your property, or I'm going to close down your business. So it becomes not political solutions, but as these generals who've taken a new path to power without a respect for the republic, they begin to use violent means to consolidate and maintain that power. Marius is a similar story. He gains, again, a successful general, but gains support by recruiting disenfranchised poor soldiers, people, poor classes, saying, hey, you don't have what everybody else has. He feeds on their jealousy. Says, hey, if you follow me, if you make me your ruler, I'm going to give you everything you want. I promise you land. I'm going to take it away from all the rich Romans. I'm going to give it to the others. A real kind of socialist pitch, a Marxian pitch. And so he turns his influence and threats of power through his army and his loyal followers into 7 consulships in a row. So in other words, consul was a 1-year term, and that idea of Cincinnatus surrendering that once there was a reason for him to be in charge, these new generals like Marius, they're clinging and they hold on to power for as long as possible, just getting elected again and again and again. Probably not because people want them, but again, because they hold popular support with the people with the weapons, namely the army. And so this really leads to these new paths to power and the rise of these generals. Often we call them demagogues, ones who play upon the passions of the people, really leads to a first century of chaos. There's revolution, there's factions, there's violence. The nobles turn against the commoners get turned against the nobles. As I just mentioned, popular generals become demagogues, where rather than there being an army of the republic, there's Sulla's troops and there's Marius's troops, and there's the troops loyal to this general versus this general, and that because the generals promised to make them rich from their conquests versus what they were normally paid by the government. And so they don't care. They're no longer subjects of a republic. They're all just different gangs, leaders and tools of those leaders to maintain their power. And there's this thin veneer of they still call themselves a republic, and I was still elected to be consul, even though they know they were elected in a sham election, or they were elected because they kicked all the other side out of Rome, or they killed the leader of the opposition. And so it still looked like a republic, but it was all being done by force and corruption. And the Senate, meanwhile, really failed to rein things in. They were supposed to be the wise advising body in all this, but they avoided reforms. They actually just sought to protect their power. In other words, if a general came in, and as long as that general promised not to take their lands or to kill them or kick them out, they'd say, okay, we support this general, not because he's actually good for the republic, but because he was willing to protect them or give them what they wanted as in their position of Senate. So that the institutions are falling apart. And so that leads to something called the First Triumvirate. Try to keep moving my picture around. And that is the power of 3 of these demagogues, 3 of these generals to form basically a power block to rule Rome. Again, still a republic, but we're going to rule it basically 3 kings, almost an oligarch to some extent. And these guys' names were Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Pompeius, or Pompey, as he's also known. And so this is a key moment because it's kind of where the veneer or the saying, we're a republic began to fall away, and it was just real practical. No, we have the force, we have the money, we have the influence and the supporters, and so we're going to run things around here. We don't care so much, whether you're the Senate or you're the tribune or you're the praetor. We actually have the real power. And so what happens is they're kind of balancing each other, because although they work together, they're also all rivals. And what happens is that guy Crassus actually ends up dying, and that leaves 2. And that's never good, because you need 3 to balance. 2 becomes a rivalry. And so Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, as he comes known, they turn on each other. And they begin to start a civil war with all of Julius Caesar's followers opposing all of Pompey's followers. And ironically, again, they were each one of the 2 consuls, but rather than work together, they basically say, okay, they begin to fight each other. I actually jumped a little bit ahead of the story here, but in becoming that first triumvirate, each of these leaders, as I said, they were kind of rivals. They each took a sphere of influence within Rome. Caesar was in charge of Gaul or France. Pompey was basically given Spain, and Crassus Syria. And this is where, again, you have Rome, which is kind of the republic, but then you have these generals ruling these territories almost like kings, almost like emperors anyway. And so again, the idea that this is a functioning democracy, or again, a functioning republic with laws that actually govern above men, that was just not true. And as I just described, the death of Crassus, who actually he'd married Caesar's daughter in order to form an alliance, a civil war breaks out, leading to open warfare. And if you've ever seen the famous depiction, this is the picture of Caesar. If you've heard of Caesar crossing the Rubicon was a river on the border of Italy and France, and it was basically the sacred boundary. And no armies were supposed to cross the Rubicon and be within Italy proper. They were supposed to be out on the frontiers of the empire, and it was illegal to bring an army and march it into Rome, because this is something that these generals had started to do. Well, Caesar, deciding that he's going to fight Pompey for ultimate dominion within Rome, marches his army from France or Gaul across the Rubicon into Italy to get rid of his rival, Pompey. He does so. Pompey actually runs away to Egypt, where he's assassinated, and Julius Caesar has himself elected dictator, emergency powers, but he says, I'm dictator for life, dictator perpetuo, where now he's going to be in charge. He's going to basically emergency powers forever, or for as long as is needed. And I'm probably going to decide that it's needed forever. And so he becomes basically a de facto ruler of Rome. Well, there's still just enough jealousy and Republican love left that the Senate cannot stand this. For him to openly declare himself dictator for life and to not at least kind of pay lip service to the Senate and pay lip service to the Republic is too much for a lot of the senators. And so in 44 BC, not too long after him declaring himself dictator for life, he is assassinated, famously by one of his close associates, Brutus, in 44 BC. Ironically, if you remember, the husband of Lucretia, who drove out Tarquin the Proud to establish the Republic, was also Brutus. And then again, it is another Brutus leading the senators to assassinate Julius Caesar in an attempt supposedly to save the Republic. However, as you can see, it's much too late. It wasn't just Julius Caesar. This was a century and more of decline, in which there were very few people who even knew what it meant to be a republic anymore. And it was so destabilized, and things had been run so corruptly for so long. We'll see the death of Julius Caesar doesn't save the republic, but causes its ultimate transformation. Because immediately what it does is it leads to the rise of the second triumvirate. And I know this is maybe getting a little complicated, but we'll review it in class. And basically, it's just another group of three powerful men. So rather than the Senate rising up and becoming, reestablishing the republic, they killed Julius Caesar, and the people are enraged. And the people say, no, how could you do that? We love Julius Caesar. He gave us what we wanted. He gave us food. He gave us peace. He gave us stability from all the chaos of all these other generals fighting each other. We've talked about, when anarchy breaks out, which Rome was in a century or decades of anarchy, even though Julius Caesar was dictator for life, people were at least like, hey, at least now we have some stability and we can go about living our lives in peace. Well, so when he died, the people actually rose up and drove the Senate out and said, you're the traitors. We want to get rid of you. And they replaced Julius Caesar with another three-person triumvirate, this time a guy named Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Octavian was actually the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and they again become three powerful men who agree to share power, but follows the same track. The pact falls apart. Lepidus, he's the Crassus of this group, he dies, and that leaves Octavian and Mark Antony to go at each other and fall into civil war. And this is the famous story. Antony flees to Egypt, where he falls into league with Cleopatra. Cleopatra believes that if she helps Antony win, he'll help her free Egypt. However, Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra in a naval battle at Actium in 31 BC. And that's where Antony and Cleopatra, knowing that they've lost, they famously commit suicide with the asp, the poisonous snake. And again, like his adopted father, Octavian finds himself as the sole survivor of this civil war. And so he, rather than say something like, oh, long live the Republic, or, I'm dictator for life, he declares himself de facto emperor of Rome. And he takes on the title bearing the name of his father. His father, Caesar, was his name, but he bears that now almost as a name of nobility, Caesar Augustus, meaning Caesar the Divine One. And his rise officially marks the end of the Republic and the beginning of what we call the Roman Empire. All right, so let's just do a quick summary slide, and we'll leave it at that. And what we're looking at here in the collapse of the republic is, how does freedom die? How did freedom and this government for the people, this res publica, how did it, with checks and balances, how did it fall into chaotic civil war and anarchy and the rise of these strong men who then transformed it into a dictatorship? Well, the key factors are: you have a loss of personal virtue, that you cannot have a free people. You cannot have a republic or a democracy if the people don't have the character to govern themselves. How can you say, I want to self govern myself, if you don't have the virtue to actually self govern yourself? And that's why the loss of the cursus honorum, the loss of Roman values, which we'll be talking about in class, the loss of the normal paths to power, or the corruption that came from becoming a heavy slave society, or a greedy, overly prosperous society, really was kind of one of the starting ingredients. Into this chaos, dictators are welcomed. This is something that Plato predicted, that, you know what, the people loved Julius Caesar. Why? Not because they cared about freedom, but when you're living in chaos, you don't want freedom. You want order, you want safety, you want peace, and you're willing to have a dictator perpetuo just to get those peace and to get that stability. The other key thing was that it happened so gradually, that if we're not well educated, and if we're not a society that teaches the children, if we teach all citizens and include all citizens in the discussion of what it means to be part of that society, what it means to be part of the Roman Republic, then the meaning of those institutions falls away. And so you can still say you have the Senate, but you're no longer a Senate of wise, elders who are doing what's best for the country. You're just a bunch of corrupt aristocracy who will do anything in order to maintain their power. So you could say, oh, you're just the consul and you're going to serve your 1 year title or term of office, but you're going to get elected 7 times. And rather than balance power with the other guy, you're going to go to war with him. Again, you can have the names of the institutions. You can say you're still a republic, but it was a gradual change over time, and all the power began to shift from the institutions to the most powerful men who are willing to do the most ruthless thing or gain the most support with either the army or the common people. And so the institutions didn't mean anything anymore. And finally, you get the fact that you get a new generation, because it's this gradual change, who they haven't, this was kind of what I was already saying, they're not educated. They don't know what the Republic was. They don't know their history. They just know that they know what happened 20 years prior. They know what happened yesterday. They know what their current circumstances are. And they're like, hey, I choose this because I don't even know what freedom is. And so they were never taught anything else. So I'm going to read some primary sources um, that get to that. But the loss of their cultural knowledge and their cultural cohesion, the loss of knowledge of their history and their morality and their values, meant that, again, how can you have a society where it's built on the self-government of all the citizens if all the citizens don't even know what they're doing, or why they should value freedom, or what a check and balance is, or what the role of a praetor and tribune were, or why should we not just chase money and power? Why should we surrender it? And so we lose those things. And so that's examples, again, which Julius Caesar can be killed, but it's far too late to save the Republic, because that generation didn't know anything else but Julius Caesar, didn't know anything else but the anarchy of Marius and Sulla. And so there was, at that point, no going back. Alrighty, we'll be talking about the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire this week, and look forward to your questions and comments. Appreciate your attention. Talk to you soon.